Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
For long before he took his first public office, that is public political office in 1991, Dr Manmohan Singh was a familiar figure in Delhi's intellectual, social, political and professional circles. Professional as in among professional economists. For us journalists also always accessible. You could always reach him out for a quote, but more importantly, for wisdom. Remember, this was the pre-television era. However, since my field was not really economics, it was many other things, but not economics, my first conversation with him took place in a totally non-journalistic context, but with reporter's luck. It was a flight from Mumbai to Delhi. This was, how far back was it? I will only tell you one thing, that this is when only Indian Airlines used to fly in India. Private airlines had not yet come in, and this was an Airbus 300, which in the course of time became obsolete. Chances are that today's Gen Zers would not have at least flown in one. They might have seen one here and there, but would not have flown in one. So it was on one of those flights, Dr. Manmohan Singh was sitting there, and I went, and as the usual trick for a reporter is to try and find time with people with whom otherwise you will find difficult to get attention. So I just sat on my knees and engaged him in conversation, because the seat next to him was occupied and every seat in the section was occupied. And we talked about the state of India's economy, the state of India as such. And he said by that time, India's economy had begun to go in a downturn already. So I'm taking you back to something like 1989, 1990, thereabouts. He had gone for a conference to Bombay, what used to be Bombay then. And he said to me, among the many things he said to me, one thing stands out. He said that, look, in our country, unless we can convince people to pay a reasonable price for the services and the goods that the state provides, like, so I asked him what? He said electricity, water, highways, etc. Unless we convince them to pay a reasonable price for these, the country really has no future. In the course of time, the country will become ungovernable and its economy will become unsustainable. Now, if you see many of the reforms which have taken place, very painful reforms in the 30 years since or 35 years since, many of them pertain to electricity, highways. In some of those, people have learned to pay. Electricity is a work in progress. Highways, people have learned to pay. Water hasn't got anywhere as yet, because that is something no politician wants to touch. So these were the most difficult reforms in our governance, which he had pointed out at that point. So the first lesson I learned from that short conversation, which took place because I had pretty much ambushed him on a flight, mid-flight, and sort of railroaded him into having that conversation, when probably he would rather read the day's newspaper, or maybe think about something, or reflect on something, or maybe just take a snooze. The lesson was that here is a man who always has wisdom for you. Anytime you have a conversation with him, you learn something. He's not trying to sell you an idea or politics or seek votes, but he's got the weight of intellect. He's got the weight of intellect, sincerity, and also a certain candor, which usually people did not associate with Dr. Manmohan Singh. But as time passed, I figured that was one of his great qualities as well. So the lesson from the first conversation was that India has to make its people learn to pay, or accept the idea that they have to pay for many services that they take for granted, as if the state has to provide all of these for free. Unless that happens, he said, India has no future. As I told you, some of this has been fixed, but a lot still hasn't been fixed. Then he got his job as finance minister, became globally famous. Narasimha Rao's favorite for some time until Narasimha Rao began to run into other kinds of crises. Yet Narasimha Rao stood by him through those 5 years. Those 5 years, I wasn't covering politics at that level, nor was I covering economics or markets or banking, so I did not get much of an opportunity to talk with him. But politicians are much more accessible once they are out of power. So once the Narasimha Rao government's tenure ended in 1996, shortly after that, that is when I had just taken over as editor of Indian Express, I reached out to him and I said, "Sir, you had promised me a longer conversation and you said, I will call you for lunch and we will talk. So I'm now reminding you, you might have some time now. Why don't you give me some time?" So sure enough, he called me for lunch. Now a couple of the sidelights from that lunch, I will reserve for the conclusion of this episode of Cut The Clutter. Meanwhile, I will tell you the second substantive thing that came from him. The first substantive thing was to get people of India to start paying something, a reasonable price for what they get from the state, without which everything is unsustainable. The second thing I learned this time, he said, and this must have been in 1996, sometime late 96, he said, India has had some economic growth and it is set on the path of growth. Now India needs an expansive infrastructure program, while at the same time continuing to do a lot more of what we've been doing. Of course, you could always get up and raise the question that how come when he became Prime Minister for 10 years subsequently, he did not build so much infrastructure. He would have told you that his degree of difficulty in that political environment was much greater than would be the case now under the Modi government. Nevertheless, under his tenures as Prime Minister, not that much infrastructure was built. There wasn't that much focus. But this is something that he spoke about because intellectually, he always had a sense of what India needed. But we'll come back to this lunch. But we will come back to this lunch towards the conclusion of this episode. So please stay with me. Third, and I will share a link with you, our Walk the Talk interview just on the eve of the 2004 elections. By that time, it did not look like the odds were that Vajpayee was coming back to power again. It didn't look like Congress party was going to be anywhere close to power. And as we know, this election result came out against the run-off play. And Congress came to power through UPA, but that happened subsequently. That conversation, once again, an intellectual point, because I asked him that you were a socialist. First up, we started talking from the classroom where he had taught, the exact classroom where he used to teach in Delhi School of Economics. I said, you were a socialist, a lifelong socialist, and then you went completely the other way. How did this happen? He said, look, I'm still a socialist, but socialism doesn't mean that you stick to a doctrine. I'm not a doctrinaire socialist. I also change as times change. And he says, look at all the great socialists. They were not doctrinaire. They evolved and changed with the times. However, he said that in governance, sometimes challenges have to be so big that you have to find ways of dealing with them which come from your moral strength, credibility, whatever. For example, he says that when Narasimha Rao government came to power, it was a minority government. It was a minority government, had not yet passed its vote of confidence, and yet India had just about $1 billion worth of foreign exchange, which is about 2 weeks worth of exports. And he said, it is the first time that I figured how serious the situation was. He said we had foreign exchange for just about 2 weeks worth of imports. And either, if we did not carry out immediate reform and do some drastic things, either we would have to impose such restrictions on imports that inflation will shoot up, that there will be a run on the markets, that the poor people will really suffer. And he says inflation at that point was already, they had inherited from VP Singh and Chandrasekhar, was already running close to 20%. So among the most important things that needed to be done, and the first things was a devaluation of the rupee. And that had been waiting for a long time. And see, he says in that interview that devaluation of the rupee, or letting the rupee become quote unquote weaker in India, is always a big political decision, a big politically contentious issue. And it took me back to the early 60s. And he said the World Bank had told India in 1962 that the rupee was overpriced, it should be devalued. But there were internal differences in the cabinet, so it could not happen. So what should have been done in 62 actually got done in 1966. That's when the devaluation was carried out. That is how difficult this is politically. And yet, once they figured this has to be done, he went to meet the RBI governor then, and between themselves, obviously with Narasimha Rao's approval, they announced a devaluation of the rupee. And that is what convinced the world that this government, although it was a minority government, it meant business. And then IMF and the rest happened. So that is the third lesson, that once you are in public office, you do what you think is right by your country and what do you think your job demands, and then take the risks that need to be taken. Of course, in this case, he was covered for the risks by Narasimha Rao. That is something that we'll talk about as we go along. So that was the first big step that he took. That was the devaluation of the rupee. And once again, with a minority government still struggling for a vote of confidence. Now, in the same year, 2004, when I had this walk the talk conversation with Dr. Manmohan Singh, I had one with PV Narasimha Rao also. Probably for him also the only full-length interview on camera. It was a two-part walk the talk interview on NDTV, and I will again share the links with you. Now, what happened? In the conversation with Dr. Manmohan Singh, he said, I asked him, did you know that there were these risks? And he said, yes, there were these risks. And Manmohan Singh told me that, look, you are doing all this. If anything goes wrong, then you are the one who will be sacrificed, right? So I asked him, so you were going to be the scapegoat, and both of us had a laugh. Now, later in the conversation with PV Narasimha Rao, both of these conversations were on camera and they are available for you to check out. In the conversation with Narasimha Rao, I raised the same question. I said, did you tell Dr. Manmohan Singh that if something goes wrong, he will be sacrificed? And Narasimha Rao said, no, I didn't say such a thing. Arey Baba, he was somebody who knew what to do because he had the mind, he had the intellect. I was behind him, backing him solidly. In fact, I told my party people and others, those who were criticizing him, that don't criticize him. I am a political person. I am the political person. Please criticize me. So I leave both of these to your assessment. Dr. Manmohan Singh saying that Narasimha Rao said to him that he will be sacrificed if things go wrong. And Narasimha Rao then saying that I was standing solidly behind him and I told everybody that if you want to criticize me, not Manmohan Singh. Now, who was right, who was wrong? I leave it to your judgment to figure this out. I just have both of these interviews on camera, on the record. Please check them out. As Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh was very communicative with the media. In some ways, even more communicative than Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Vajpayee was very accessible, more accessible than Dr. Manmohan Singh, but Vajpayee talked less. With Vajpayee, even if you went to see him, there were long silences. And by the time you figured that you have to wait out those silences until he speaks, too much time had been lost. Manmohan Singh, on the other hand, you spent quality time with him and he engaged with you and he spoke freely. In one of those conversations, for example, not just with me, he had invited a group of editors, and there he gave us his basic insight on India's foreign policy. He said the problem with India's foreign policy is that China is able to use Pakistan to triangulate India between themselves and Pakistan at a very cheap price. So China is an instrument of very cheap triangulation of India by China. Now India has to break out of this triangulation. India can either do it by making up with China or it can do it by making up with Pakistan. His idea was that when you negotiate, it's better to negotiate with the country compared to which you have more power. So you have a stronger negotiating position. That's the reason he put out his political capital on negotiating with Pakistan. And this is something that he was trying to explain to us in this conversation, which was meant to be off the record. And I'm not breaking any confidences even now, because the next morning we found that the editor who had gone from the Times of India then had actually reported this conversation. Either he didn't hear that this was meant to be off the record, or maybe he thought that this was too important to be kept off the record. So this point of the triangulation came out in the Times of India the next day. My own understanding of him is that nuclear deal was his finest hour, I would say. And that is something I will talk about maybe in some more detail in the national interest today. This is also something on which he probably expended too much political capital, because he had very limited political capital. In every conversation, this came out. He's continuing to say almost self-pityingly that, look, my power is limited. I am an appointed prime minister. He didn't say accidental to me. He said, I am an appointed prime minister. Mrs. Gandhi has appointed me. The party has appointed me. I can't defy them, and I can't keep doing things that they don't want. The nuclear deal, however, is something that the party was not easy with, and yet he did it. And can you imagine the kind of consternation he would have caused in the party? And when he told George Bush, the US president then, that President Bush, people of India love you very dearly, or something to that effect. That is not the kind of language any Indian prime minister has used about any American president. And definitely until then, nobody had, because India was still coming out, still growing out from a history of hostility to the US. And this, remember, was a Congress government on the nuclear deal. And we talked about this many times. I think he was happy that we in the Indian Express had figured that nuclear deal was not about nuclear energy. It was called civil nuclear deal, but this was not about producing more nuclear power. And sometimes people say even now that, oh, what's the point of the nuclear deal? Not 1 megawatt of nuclear power has come because of that. But the nuclear deal was not about power. The nuclear deal was about repositioning India strategically. And that's what he managed to do decisively. And that is what got him a lot of criticism within the party. The party stood by him. The party stood by him with the vote of confidence. He risked his government on the nuclear deal. Party fought for him. They also did whatever they did by way of manipulating votes, etc. You've seen some of that cash for vote stuff on your TV screens. So a lot of that tamasha happened, and the party stood by him. But I do believe that he expended quite a lot of political capital with that, and the party was waiting with the knife sharpened for the opportunity to strike back, which came very soon, because nuclear deal 2008, 2009, just as he got re-elected the second time, and this time the Congress party got many more seats, UPA got many more seats. In that high, he had a meeting with the Pakistani Prime Minister in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and they signed a joint declaration. That is something that got criticism from his rivals, not just rivals, political rivals of the Congress party, also from within the Congress party. And the Congress party rejected that joint declaration, and he was not the same man again. And then many of the subsequent conversations, he sort of talked regretfully, but also philosophically about this, basically to say that a leader like me has to know my limitations. Now, that is not something that I would agree with, and that's again a conversation we had a little bit later, because this pretty much coincided with Pranab Mukherjee getting the finance ministry. Pranab Mukherjee always wanted to be the finance minister, so he got the finance ministry after Chidambaram was moved to home, following 26/11 attacks in 2008. And that is when the Vodafone retrospective amendment came in, and a few other things vis-a-vis the Reserve Bank came in. And that's when some fraught conversations took place between him and Pranab Mukherjee. Manmohan Singh had gone to Korea. In Korea, likely investors, big business houses, delegations complained to him that in India the environment was changing, that the finance ministry was rolling back a lot of the reform. There was a lot of complaints about the retrospective amendment. So when he came back, in fact, he took this up with Pranab Mukherjee. And Pranab Mukherjee said, you are the Prime Minister. If you want to overrule me, you can overrule me. You can repeal this amendment, but he would not do that. Because once again, he had internalized the idea that while he was Prime Minister, his authority was limited by the fact that he had been appointed to the job by the party. He had not been elected to the job by the people or through the party. He had been given the prime ministership by the party. In fact, I know of one more conversation where he complained to Pranab Mukherjee in the manner that Manmohan Singh could complain, that the RBI was not following policies that will be investor friendly or investment friendly. And Pranab Mukherjee said to him in front of many others who are around, he said, look, if that is the case, He's a governor, RBI governor, then Subba Rao. He's the governor that you've given an extension to. So why should I tell him to do all this? You tell him to do all this. So once again, Manmohan Singh was not able to overrule Pranab Mukherjee. We had many conversations about this. He complained about many things, including the fact that on the nuclear deal, a lot of leaks were taking place from the Prime Minister's office to the Hindu, and those stories were opposing, and those stories and that information was being used or in his words, misused to attack the nuclear deal. And I said to him, but you are the Prime Minister, you deal with this. I mean, what can I do with it? If a leak comes to me, I will also see what I can do with the leak. You are the Prime Minister. But he would again say things which would underline his limitations within the political structure. Corruption allegations followed, 2G, Commonwealth Games, that was 2010, etc., etc. That was the peak of the scam mania. All kinds of scams emerged. Supreme Court was talking. Supreme Court was admonishing the Prime Minister's office. That is around time that one day I got a phone call from him. I rarely got a phone call from his office saying, the Prime Minister wants to speak with you, but I got a phone call from him. I can pretty much put a date to it. That was the customary lunch that Arun Jaitley used to host at his birthday or around that time. So you can say 26th December. So I went aside. It was a crowded outdoors lunch. So I went aside some distance away from the noise and took the call. And he was a bit upset and he was angry. And he said, Arun Shourie has said that he met me at the entrance of Parliament and gave me a file containing all the details on the 2G scam. You published whatever he said. Why didn't you check with me or my office what our view is? All of you have access to us. So I said, I don't know. Maybe we should have done it. But this is Arun Shourie. He has his own credibility. His word carries weight. So when he said that he had handed over these papers to you, these files to you, we have to take it at face value. So he said other things. He said, look, so many people hand over so many things to me. If somebody really wanted action taken on a serious issue, person could have come to see me. Arun Shourie also has access to me, could have come to see me, etc., etc. So we had that conversation, but I could see that was an unhappy conversation. He was complaining, not that I could have done anything about it, but I heard him out. And if it was an admonition, I let it be, because that did not change anything that we were doing editorially on the issue. Now, of the conversations I really cherish, one of those was when he talked about his meeting with Musharraf, his first meeting with General Musharraf. I said to General Musharraf that, look, you and I are both, in this case he used the word accidental. He said, you and I are both accidental leaders of our country. I would have preferred to say providential, but he said accidental leaders of our country. I had never thought I'll become Prime Minister. You never thought you will become President of your country. So I did sort of half-jokingly corrected him to say that, look, sir, anybody in Pakistan who gets commissioned as an officer in the army believes that one day he will become President of Pakistan. That's why for Musharraf or for any Pakistani military officer, this cannot be such an accidental thing. They all expect to become leaders of their country. However, what is it that he said to Musharraf? He said that, look, you and I have both got public office. We never planned for it. We got it. The thing with public office is that you can't have public office and then do nothing with it, because public office is like public trust. Once you have it, you have to do something with it. So he used that argument to drive Musharraf towards a settlement with India. And it looked like they were getting close to something. Of course, the degree of difficulty on selling that to public opinion in India would have been enormous. But if you read the details in Satinder Lamba's book, Satinder Lamba, our former top foreign service officer, was the back channel emissary for this. Satinder Lamba, our former High Commissioner to Pakistan and top foreign service officer, was the back channel negotiator with Pakistan on this issue. So a lot of this detail has come out in his book as well. If he had been able to push this through, that might have been his riskiest move yet. However, that was not to happen because Musharraf meanwhile got into trouble with his judiciary. He fought with them, he started too many internal battles and ultimately lost power, which is also something that Manmohan Singh always regretted, and he always said that he wished that Musharraf had shown a little bit more foresight and generosity that any leader must always have. Of course, I did remind him sort of half jokingly that this was a military general in Pakistan, Musharraf. Which military general in Pakistan thinks that he needs to show any generosity to anybody, least of all to his own people and to his own political system? So Musharraf fell in the familiar trap for Pakistani dictators. Everybody who holds public office has some core skills or some core strengths. For Manmohan Singh, it was economics, his knowledge of economics. He was our only economist leader, finance minister, prime minister, public figure, leader, parliamentarian. So if you sat with him and if he had a little time, you could always get an economics tutorial. I did ask him once, for example, that look, I keep reading that the Chinese are buying so much into American bonds. By buying American bonds, they are financing America's deficit. So America can keep on running its deficit, printing more money, and China buys those bonds. So what happens one day if China decides to destroy America and sells those bonds? What will happen to America's economy, America's dollar? So Dr. Singh smiled and he said, you know what will happen? Dollar will collapse, American markets might collapse, dollar will collapse, but as the dollar collapses, Chinese yuan will shoot up in value. When that happens, China's export market will be destroyed. China's exports will come to a standstill and Chinese economy will be destroyed as well. So why would they do such a suicidal thing? The lesson was, again to somebody who has not read Economics 101, simply that in these matters also, even on the larger economic issues, there is mutual deterrence between big powers, all mutually assured destruction, MAD, the doctrine that we use for nuclear weapons. So one can't just decide to destroy the other. That is very relevant now when people once again are talking about this and saying that Chinese are holding the keys to US economy because they own so much of the American bonds, etc., etc. And now this will be the end of the dollar and de-dollarization, etc. And other currencies will rise. In fact, the more I hear of that, the more I remember this conversation with Dr. Singh. And now I will take you back to that lunch. At that lunch, it was a usual Punjabi Delhi lunch, vegetarian, matar paneer, one dal, some little cucumber, onion salad, and rotis, etc. While we had that lunch, two of his grandchildren were playing. After the lunch came dessert, and dessert, once again it was a Punjabi household, was semia. So one of his grandsons really liked semia. So he came for semia, sort of as little kids do, and I grabbed that bowl. And I said, all of this is for me, you will not get any. So this little kid got a little bit irritated, and I was monkeying with him. At which point, Mrs. Singh, Gusharan Kaurji, Mrs. Singh, she got upset with me and she said, what are you doing? Why are you giving trouble to this child? I said, listen, I'm just monkeying with him. I monkey with my children also like that. She said, you can go home and monkey with your own children like this. You will not do it to my grandchildren. Put this bowl down and you take out what you want in your katori. Which by this time, my tail between my legs, I dutifully did and did not bother the children anymore. So I thought that's also a story I should share with you today.